Welcome to this how-to video for the How to Learn French ebook. So in this video I'm going to show you how to get the most out of this guide, and we'll also cover the fundamental principles for language learning so that you can get off to a great start learning French. So to start with, we'll go to the table of contents. And apologies, by the way, if you can hear traffic in the background. I'm in Hanoi in Vietnam. So yeah, it's a wonderful city, but it's never quiet, which I love, but it does mean that in videos there is a bit of traffic in the background. So before we get started looking at the different parts of this guide, I just want to talk about this table of contents in general. Now, you'll see it's very detailed and numbered and arranged in like parts, chapters, sub-chapters and sections, and that's so that you can use this guide in a flexible way. You know, you can read it cover to cover if you'd like to, and I'd recommend doing that if you'd enjoy that. But you can also just use this guide as a reference tool if you're not a big fan of reading, for example. It's very clear where everything is, so you can jump from section to section based on what you're wanting to check up on at a given time. Now, before we look at the 5 key parts of this guide, we'll just go to the top left here, and how to use this guide we're covering now. Why I started How to Learn Languages, that's just there in case it's interesting and useful for you to read about my experiences learning languages and how these shaped my approach to learning languages, and therefore why I created How to Learn Languages. But yeah, that's not essential. It's just I know that some people like to read about the context of the stuff they're reading or listening to, so that's there in case you'd like to read about that. Now, defining fluency, more information in the guide, but for now it's worth just mentioning because sometimes when people talk about fluency they think of being able to use the language like a first language speaker, like a French speaker, but actually that level is proficiency, and fluency is a level below that. So fluency still means being very comfortable with the language, such as being able to understand the vast majority of what you listen to or read in French, and being able to speak the language without hesitating or pausing for much thought. But even then, it's still just a level below proficiency. So if you follow the CEFR, which is the common European framework of reference for languages, I guess fluency would be around the B2 level, which is widely acknowledged to be a broad level. And proficiency is like C1, certainly C2. So yeah, that's just a definition of fluency anyway. Now, we'll go through each part of the guide, but to start with, we'll look at number 1, the overview. And that's because regardless of how you want to use this guide, this is the part of the guide I'd recommend reading regardless of whether you want to use it as just a reference tool or not, because in the overview we cover the fundamental principles for learning any language, and also just a bit about some of the more controversial aspects of language learning and how these may apply to learning French. As an example, how to study grammar, we cover that in that How to Learn French section here. And yeah, just basically you can study grammar in isolation if you enjoy it as a separate part, an add-on to the process. But if you don't enjoy studying grammar in isolation, you don't have to at all, so don't worry about that. Now, we'll also cover the fundamental principles of language learning now, so that you also have an even greater understanding of the format of this guide, because this guide is set up and designed with these principles in mind. So, we go to How to Learn Languages here. Now, this is where you'll learn about the fundamental principles in the guide, and obviously, as I said, I'd recommend reading this part of the guide regardless of how you want to use the guide, but I'll also cover it now so that you can get off to a great start learning French. So there are 3 essential elements to language learning, and these are passive learning, active learning and practice. Now, fortunately, passive learning is the easiest element to incorporate into our daily lives, and also arguably the most important. It, as you can kind of tell from the name, it's very passive, and so it's about immersing in French, but not needing to really focus on what you're immersing on. For example, you could be immersing in a French podcast on your commute to work, or whilst cooking or cleaning or doing exercise, just about anything you can think of where you're not having to totally focus on what you're listening to. Now, it's absolutely essential that the content you immerse in from your first day immersing in French is content that French speakers would listen to, first language speakers. And that's so that your brain, as soon as possible, can develop its understanding of the sounds and sound patterns of the French language, as that is how you eventually come to understand the language fluently. Now, something worth mentioning on that is the idea of comprehensible input. Now, comprehensible input basically means using materials or resources where you can understand the majority of that content. For example, something where you already understand maybe 70, 80 or 90% of the material, and so there's therefore like 30, 20, 10% of it you don't understand. And the logic behind that is that, if you understand the majority of it already, it will make understanding the bits you don't yet understand much easier. You'll be able to figure it out through the context of what you already do understand. And there's nothing wrong with that as a concept in and of itself. It makes sense and it's not incorrect. However, the reason I thought it worth mentioning now is that it's become very popular as an idea on YouTube especially, and I think it's very misleading, unfortunately. Not deliberately misleading, of course, but it is misleading because the term input makes people think, I need to be immersing in material I can understand a fair amount of already, and that's not what immersing is for at all. So I want you to not think of passive learning in terms of comprehensible input. You can completely forget about that concept in that regard. Your passive learning is just for immersing in content that French language speakers would listen to, that first language speakers would listen to. Now, comprehensible input can be useful during the active part of the process, and we'll cover why now. So active learning is basically just learning new phrases. So you could call this sentence collecting. I call it that. Other people I've seen call it chunking, sentence mining. You'll have come across different ways of referring to it, but they all refer to the same thing, which is basically just learning new phrases. And as you can tell, it's important to learn the phrases themselves, not just learning individual words. So by learning phrases in their whole, you not only learn all the words in that phrase, so you get more bang for your buck in that sense, but you also naturally develop your understanding of grammar, because all phrases contain grammar. And you'll also get a sense of how to use these phrases in conversation just by the fact of, what's within that phrase. You'll get a sense of when you could use that. Whereas if you learn an individual word, it'll be up to you how to fit it into, construct phrases from scratch and stuff, and that can lead to all sorts of confusions with grammar and unnatural sentences and that sort of thing. And also it's much more boring to learn a language by learning individual words and less effective. So you focus on whole phrases, and you would, for example, on its most basic form of sentence collecting, you would note them down or write them down, say them aloud to yourself, and practice them with French speakers. Now, you can make this a little bit more interesting by using something I call active listening and reading, which is basically where you still try to learn new phrases, but by using content or materials that either French language speakers would use or that have been created in an interesting way for people learning French. Now, obviously in the guide we go into much more detail about that, and I'll cover a bit more detail about that shortly in this video. But for now, just be aware that sentence collecting, you can do it in its most basic form, that's absolutely fine, but there are ways to make it more interesting if you'd like to. Now, in terms of how to remember what you learn, the most effective way is to practice with French speakers, because the most effective way to remember things is to use them. So by using the phrases you learn in conversation with French speakers, it's a very authentic way to use them, a very effective way to use them. Now, that's obviously part of the process. It's one of the key pillars for learning a language, as we've mentioned, but alongside that I would recommend using some other memory techniques to aid your retention of the phrases you're learning, and we'll cover those shortly. Now, in terms of practice, obviously this is going to help you get more comfortable in conversation with French speakers, but also, as we've said, very useful for remembering the phrases you're learning during active learning. And also it will, but people often obsess over the idea of fluency or becoming fluent. Well, practice is the key thing for becoming fluent in inverted commas, because the act of having a conversation where you're having to respond in real time, that practice of getting used to using a certain phrase in response to a certain situation or a certain question, that practice of getting used to using that response will become more and more automatic, and that is fluency. By the time it becomes automatic, that's when, in other situations in, real life, you get asked a question and you already immediately, without even having to think, respond in French with an appropriate phrase because you've practiced it already many times. Now, those are the key pillars for learning languages. We'll now go through the process itself laid out in this guide. So, we start with an introduction to French, which gives you a really solid foundation in, the key elements of the language itself. Now, as I said, this guide is flexible, so if you want to use it as a reference tool, you don't need to read all of this. However, I would recommend reading the orientation part here, because in there we cover alphabet and pronunciation, which obviously is essential for learning any language, so I definitely recommend reading that part. And in that part you'll see links to a series of videos on YouTube made by excellent YouTube channels for learning French, which take you through alphabet and pronunciation. So that'll be a really essential help for you, because alphabet and pronunciation, you have to listen to it. So I'd obviously recommend reading that part, and then below that we've got the head start. Now this isn't necessarily essential in and of itself, but I'd definitely recommend reading it regardless of how you want to use this guide, because in there you'll learn about all the shared vocabulary between French and English, and there's an awful lot. A third of the words in English are thought to come from French, another third from Latin, which most of those are also in French, so there's a huge amount of shared vocabulary between the two. And after reading the head start and reading about the different forms of words where there is this overlapping vocabulary, you'll feel very encouraged about the rest of the process. So I definitely recommend that. In the head start, I also briefly mentioned about the historical reasons for this shared vocabulary. If you're wanting to learn more about the history of the French language, then I'd recommend reading the history section over here. Now, this isn't essential, but it will really enrich the process for you and give you a deeper understanding of French. For example, there will be words you come across during your immersion, active learning, etc., which, you'll see it and think, oh, I read about that in the history part, and I know that actually that word came from another language, or, you'll know the historical roots of that word, and it's just, you'll get nice moments like that during the process. And it can just really enrich the process. But that being said, as I mentioned, it's not essential, and you don't have to read that part. Now, if you do want to read that part, but you're itching to get on with the rest of the process, then what I would recommend doing is reading the rest of the guide, getting started with the process, and then you can always go back to read this part, the history part. Now, beyond that, defining French up here, I'd recommend reading that just to get your bearings, but again, it's not absolutely essential. And why learn French? That's just there because, obviously if you've made it to this point, you're familiar with your motivations for learning French, but I've included that more just so, when learning anything, and especially when learning a language, it's not an overnight process, so there will be days at some point during the process where, for whatever reason, some external reasons, your motivation isn't as high as it would usually be. So, days like that, it might be helpful to go back, read Why Learn French, just to rekindle some of the fire you had for learning the language if needs be. Now after this, we've got the settling in part of the process. Now this is basically just a few days to a few weeks where you'll just immerse in French, nothing else. And this is very important for giving you a solid foundation in the language, getting familiar with the sound patterns of the language. And it means that, when you go to include active learning and practice, after the settling in period, you're already, very comfortable and familiar with the language, on a basic level. the reason I recommend doing that is, if for example you started active learning and practice straight away without doing any settling in and immersing, then you could do that, but it might be a bit, especially if you've never delved into French before at all, it would be a bit daunting, a bit overwhelming, it'd be very unfamiliar, and that could affect motivation and so on. So I'd recommend at least a few days, and as much as a few weeks if you can. Now obviously, if after a few days you find yourself itching to get on with the rest of the process, that's absolutely fine, by all means do. But if you're not in too much of a rush, then a few weeks give you a really strong foundation to get started with active learning and practice. Now, we cover here creating a routine, but as mentioned, fortunately with Immersion it's pretty simple to attach to your routine because it's passive. So again, commute to work, cooking, cleaning, exercise and so on. And then here you've got resources for Immersion, which are lots of different mediums and topics where you can find stuff to immerse in French on stuff you're interested in. And also, some of that will also be useful for active learning later on. Now, we've got podcasts and radio, music, audiobooks, books, series and films, YouTube, news and articles. And if we just look at YouTube, for example, we've got channels for learning French here, which, depending on what type of content they do, will have some good stuff for immersion, but especially good stuff for active learning. And then after that, loads of great things for immersion, like vlogs, cooking, art, books, current affairs, sport, education, history, and so on. So the other thing that's really helpful, especially with YouTube, is that when, say for example, in the resources section you find a channel that you really like on a topic you're interested in, YouTube, I know the algorithm can have its, something a bit sinister about these tech algorithms as well, but a benefit at least is that YouTube's algorithm will notice that you're enjoying that channel and that topic, the topics covered by that channel, and it will start suggesting more French channels on those topics you're interested in. So your immersion can really start to snowball, and you can find all sorts of great channels for immersing in French. Now, once you've completed the settling in process, which again, anywhere between a few days to a few weeks, depending on your preference, you'll start the path to fluency, which, as touched upon previously, that's when you include active learning and practice alongside your immersion. So just to clarify, your immersion continues throughout the whole process. Now, to begin with, in the path to fluency, we'll look at passive learning in more detail so that you can get even more out of it. For example, tips and techniques like changing the language of your devices or phone to French, just so you can get even more immersion automatically on a daily basis, stuff like that. We then go into active learning in much more detail, but don't worry, if you're wanting to use this as a reference tool, not a big fan of reading, then overview of active learning gives you the essential bullet points about active learning, and then you can just click on resources as you see fit. If you are wanting to read more, we go into detail about sentence collecting here, free resources, paid resources. Now, just quickly, the difference between free resources and paid resources in general is rarely quality, it's usually just time. Paid resources can often save you time because they've been arranged in a convenient way for you already. But that being said, there are plenty of free resources which you can use very conveniently already, so just go with whichever you prefer. Sentence creating, that's swapping out words from the sentences you collect and putting in other words to create new sentences, new phrases. Very fun way to learn, very effective way to learn. The only caveat is do be sure to test the sentences you create when you practice with French speakers, because now and again there will be sentences you've created which actually French speakers wouldn't use, and that's fine. Making mistakes in inverted commas is absolutely fine. It's a natural and very important part of the process, so please don't even think in terms of making mistakes. They're not mistakes really. And there'll also be loads of sentences you create which actually French speakers would use, so don't worry. Now, active listening and reading, here we'll cover a bit of the theory behind it, but also loads of resources and mediums you can use to actively listen and read. So if you find sentence collecting in its most basic form a little bit boring, that's fine. You can do active listening and reading. Now, in terms of how to remember what you learn, as I mentioned earlier, use these memory techniques as a complement to your practice to help you remember the phrases you learn even more. So we've got SRS, which are spaced repetition systems like Anki, which basically flashcard software. Again, use those if you enjoy them, but you don't have to. They are not essential like they're made out to be on YouTube, far from it, and they have their drawbacks as well. So only use them if you enjoy them. I personally like using a notebook. Like when I was actively learning Vietnamese, found a notebook very enjoyable. And just for example, in terms of combining the two, active listening and reading, I would do my active listening and reading and keep a notebook of my active listening and reading. I wouldn't literally note down like, these are the phrases I'm collecting today, stuff like that. I would just say, for example, write out a transcript from a vlog in Vietnamese about daily life in Vietnam. And, by writing it out, sort of subliminally collecting phrases that way without literally noting them down. Now, of course, I'd recommend literally noting them down as well if you enjoy that and would like to. That's also extremely effective, so do that if you'd like to. But just to show you the variety of approaches within these broad principles that you can take. Now, you can also do a diary, that's also very good. Voice memos. Chorusing is a good way to remember what you learn, but it's also a fantastic way to improve your pronunciation. Now, in terms of practice, in this part, we'll talk about different forms of practice, typed or spoken conversation, that sort of thing, audio messages. You can adjust that based on how, shy you're feeling, especially at the start, for instance. And also the apps you can use, like Tandem and HelloTalk, to chat with French speakers. Now, with practice, I'd recommend, practicing as soon as possible, once you start the path to fluency, that is. But if you're feeling a bit shy, for instance, you can, think of scenarios in your head and think about how you'd respond in French to those scenarios. That's okay. But yeah, that aside, do try to start as soon as you can once you've begun the path to fluency. Now, putting it all together just covers how to turn all this into, a routine for learning French, that includes your immersion, your active learning, and your practice. Now, obviously more detail in the book that you can read about that, and everyone's plans will look slightly different because we'll all have slightly different schedules, slightly different preferences for resources, stuff like that. But the fundamental thing for everyone to remember is just to be flexible, because our lives, our schedules change on a monthly, weekly, sometimes even daily basis. So our plans for learning languages have to adjust accordingly as well. Now, it can be very frustrating when this happens, especially if you've really been motoring with the language, been in a great rhythm with your routine and stuff. But sometimes life, things happen, and you're busy with other stuff, and that's fine. Just try not to get too disheartened, and remember you can be very flexible and adaptable with your plan for learning French. As an example, you'll often see on YouTube all sorts of wonderful, elaborate Notion templates and spreadsheets that people have made for learning the language they're learning, and it all looks very fancy and detailed, and that's grand. There's nothing wrong with that if you enjoy that, and by all means do that. However, whoever makes those, everyone's lives will change, the schedules will change over time, and so plans will have to change. So unless that's something you really enjoy doing, like making really granular plans, I wouldn't recommend doing that unless it's something you enjoy, because the plan will have to change anyway. So if you've made it really granular, it's going to take more time to adjust it and faff around with it and stuff. So yeah, only do that level of detail plan if you enjoy it. And as an example for a more general approach, I personally just go on Apple Notes and just keep a bit of a note about stuff I might want to immerse in over the coming days and weeks, how I'm going to do my active learning over the next few days and weeks, at most maybe the next month or two, and because it's in Apple Notes, I can just very quickly, and the very basic notes, I can just edit and adjust it very easily in line with changes to my daily life, my schedule and stuff. So yeah, be flexible. Now, in what next, that's just how to keep improving with your French once you've reached fluency. Basically, it just comes down to continuing to immerse and practice with French speakers. At that point, there isn't really much active learning you need to be doing, if at all. And yeah, if you're really wanting to kick on to proficiency, like the level of a French speaker, a first language speaker, what's often the difference between fluency and proficiency is actually, first language speakers' understanding of culture, society, history in the place they live is so profound compared to someone learning the language that, you know, they can talk about things to such an intimate level of detail that someone who's just fluent wouldn't necessarily be able to. So to bridge that gap, I'd recommend just trying to learn about, you know, French culture, society, history as much as you can, and that will add context to your learning. You'll be able to understand things in a more profound way. And yeah, that applies to, of course, any French-speaking country where you're focusing on learning French as well. Now, below that, got a bit of information about how to get your French level certified should you wish to, but obviously you don't have to unless, you know, unless it's for work or study purposes where you've got to. Don't feel like you have to get your French level certified. And then below that we've got tutorials like how to add audio to flashcards, overcoming challenges. I'd recommend reading that whenever you're struggling for motivation or you're having to take a break from the language. It will guide you through that. But the key thing is, don't feel too disheartened. You know, sometimes life gets in the way, that's fine. And yeah, below that we've got how to learn 2 languages at once. Now, I've included that because, you know, often when people learn a language, they find that, you know, they've enjoyed the process so much that they want to learn more languages. So that part will show you how to do that. And then just below that we've got images here, some of the images in this book. If you know, think, oh, you'd love to visit that place or learn more about that place, you can find out where it is here and also who took it, you know, on Unsplash. And below that, contact, please feel free to email me at contact@howtolearnlanguages.info and I'll get back to you promptly. I'd be more than happy to help. You know, anytime you've got a question, just let me know. I'd be very happy to help. And below that we've got reviews. Please feel free to leave a review if you enjoyed this guide. I'd be delighted to hear your feedback. On that reviews page, you know, you can find the link to where to leave a review on the website, or you can just email a review to me. I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts. And yeah, that just about covers everything. So I wish you the best of luck learning French, and any questions, let me know. I hope you enjoy learning French.